Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, and welcome to another episode of CTO Insights. On this week's show, I'm very pleased to welcome a very old friend. So that makes him sound ancient already. So sorry about that. But somebody I've known for a long time. We're within the industry for probably 16, 17 years. So so it's great to have him back on the show. We've done a bunch of podcasts together in the past, although never Tech Takeaways or CTO Insights. So this is very exciting. So he's a technologist and also an author, and we'll be kind of picking up on that. But we're not here to plug his book, but it is going to form a big part of what we're talking about. So without further ado, let me welcome this week's guest. It's Matt Watts. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Paul, how are you? I'm looking forward to losing my virginity on your podcast today.
Great. It's not that kind of show, Matt. But yeah, we'll come back there. Those shows are available on the internet if you want them. So, look, let's jump in. I mean, I've known you a long time, but you're going to be new to lots of our audience. So why don't we jump in with tell people about who you are, what it is you do, and we can jump in then.
Yeah, so I won't go through the long kind of history of it, but so I'm Matt Watts, and I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist for NetApp. And really what that role entails is a couple of different things. The first one is I'm looking at that kind of what's next. So not kind of what's coming in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of things like roadmap items. I'm looking for those bigger events, those things that are going to have a more profound impact on the industry. And then as I learn those things through a whole bunch of stuff we can talk about, then I share that both back into NetApp, because it's a good way of us starting to think as an organization, how do we prepare ourselves for it? But with those learnings, I then go out and spend as much time as I can with clients, prospects, partners, anybody who wants to listen, really, and share some of those kind of thoughts, those perspectives, so that, people who maybe don't have that same exposure to that kind of longer term trends can get to hear about it and start to think about some of those things.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, and that's why I was so keen to have you on this show, because that's kind of part of what we're trying to do here. Is that for our kind of CTO audience, so that's people who are CTOs, people who want to be CTOs, or people who are in IT leadership positions. I think one of the challenges that lots of people have in those roles is, when do I get that opportunity to learn? How do I get to and I find, similar to you, I find that's part of my role, is to spend my time. But because I don't have a job where it's up to me to keep everybody's IT running and keep a business's lights on. My role is partly to have conversations like this, to meet with vendors, to look at what's going on in the industry, and then to try and turn that into something that's useful to help customers deal with kind of business challenges. So a few months back, when I found out you was writing this,
yes.
So I'm going to plug this a little bit.
Thank you.
But available on Amazon to order. We'll put a link in the show notes. But I thought it'd be a really interesting thing to read, because I know you've done some work similar to this, and it's kind of built on something you've done before, although, as we were talking beforehand, has never been in book form before. Yeah. But what was interesting for me was that kind of talks about lots of it was, you spoke to my experiences in the IT industry.
Right?
We are, yeah. So yeah, we're both 25.
Yep.
So we've not been in the industry that long, but it was really interesting to see kind of how this evolved, and it kind of got me thinking about this idea that as an IT leader, how do you keep on top of these trends? How do you take an approach inside of IT in an organization that allows you to kind of stay on top, but almost be flexible enough to kind of meet changes as they happen. But so we'll kind of come to that. But so the book's called The Fourth Wave. So why don't we start about what the book's about, and then I'd like to kind of look at the first three of those waves, because I think they kind of get us to where we are today. So, but tell us a little bit about the thinking behind the book, and the general idea.
So I've been with NetApp for about 19 and a half years. I started writing this. It was probably just before the pandemic, or it was around that sort of time frame, and it was very clear to me that I had a lot of content that I wanted to write. So I just started writing lots of, I don't know what they were going to be. They were going to be articles, blog posts, whatever. And the more I started writing these things, the more I started to realize there was a sort of a pattern forming. And then as I started to really analyze it, I realized that actually a lot of what I was writing represented what I could see was quite clearly was three very distinct waves that had sort of passed through the industry over my time of being with NetApp for 19 years. So I started giving it a little bit more structure, and then started to play this with this idea of the third wave. And that really was how the book was born. And we used it really as more of a training tool inside NetApp for a while. It was a great sort of asset for people coming into the company. And then I sort of left it alone. And the fourth wave was always one of those things that whenever I spoke to somebody who might have read it, typically internally, people were always asking me, what's the fourth wave? Or is AI going to be the fourth wave? And I'd been really reticent about being too kind of optimistic about it. And I'd sort of say to people, possibly.
Yeah.
And the reason I'd say possibly was that there's a characteristic of a wave that has to form, or there's a characteristic that has to happen, otherwise a wave can't form, and that's democratization. If you can't democratize a technology such that the masses can benefit from it, you can't form a wave. It just can't happen. So for several years after I wrote the third wave, I kept looking at AI thinking it has the potential, but we can't democratize it because the skills were limited, the investments were huge. And then in November last year, ChatGPT happened. And overnight, we suddenly had, or within 2 weeks, we suddenly had 200 million AI specialists in the world. And that was that moment of, we've got a fourth wave.
Yeah.
And that really triggered me to start to develop some of my thinking around the fourth wave, to add some more content into this. I took the opportunity to add in a few bits and pieces around things like sustainability, because they'd also become sort of quite top of mind. So long story short, it's been around for a while, but I'd sort of been waiting for that fourth wave as that trigger to make me do something more with it. And as soon as that happened, myself and the company decided we should get it out there, and and there it is. It's on Amazon for everyone to read. Hopefully,
it's available on Amazon. Did you say?
Yeah, available on Amazon.
Okay.
Yes.
Just checking.
In all countries.
Actually, something really interesting that you said in there, and I think it's actually a real big challenge in IT, and that's that idea of when does something that's a trend, or maybe it sounds like a cool thing that people are, when does that become something that's got some substance to it and something actually, because I think as IT leaders, one of the challenges you have is that we are bombarded all the time with this next thing, so we're now doing this, and it can often be vendors, but it can often be people like me who've kind of got excited by something that they've seen or heard or had demonstrated to them and gone, everybody needs to know about this. But actually, sometimes they come along and you think, you're not really solving a problem though, are you? You think you are, but actually nobody's really got the problem that you're talking about, or not enough people have got it. That doesn't mean they're not right, and it doesn't mean it won't become a thing over time. But I think that kind of area of understanding what moves from, I don't know, just like a cool topic to something that's got some substance and something that actually in the enterprise, because that kind of chat. What's been interesting about the kind of the ChatGPT growth for me is that it's brought that kind of conversation into the public domain, but ChatGPT itself, the thing that we know that 200 million people are using, is not really necessarily a business tool. It's not an enterprise version of doing that, but enterprise versions of that kind of technology have suddenly flooded the marketplace.
Yes.
So, but in terms of spotting a change and something that is going to be something that you might want to think about as an IT leader, that how do we introduce this to our business? How do we prepare for it? Is there anything that you look for in terms of it just being a cool thing to talk about to actually something we need to seriously consider?
Yes. I mean, there's so many signals that you have to sort of look out for. I guess the one of the first things is when I'm looking at a feature or a product. So I often quite think when a new company comes in and says, we've built this revolutionary thing, the first thing I think of is that just a feature, or have you actually built something new that really has going to have a transformative impact? I think looking back and looking at, okay, well, what was the significance of the first three waves? You can then start to draw parallels and start to say, is this thing, whatever it might be, does it have the potential to be as significant as the waves that we've seen in the past? So I think looking back over the ones that we've seen before is also quite a good litmus test for how significant is this one. And I think with, ChatGPT is interesting because we're at that moment of peak of inflated expectations. They got in a hype cycle, right? Which is, it's going to solve world hunger and fix world debt, and every company's going to be more productive and make more money. And I think companies are struggling a little bit to find the use cases.
Yeah, agreed.
And the use cases they are finding aren't the earth-shattering, game-changing ones that they were promised. It's finding more productivity. It's giving everybody an assistant who doesn't want a holiday or a coffee break or doesn't go out for a cigarette or whatever, right? But if I can give everybody in the company or a majority of people in my company an assistant that can make them 30, 40, 50% more productive, that actually is industry changing when you think about it. So there isn't a single thing. I'm always looking at lots and lots of different signs, lots of different indicators, but I think making that comparison back to some of the things that we've seen before in the past and appreciating the scale of what those earlier waves actually enabled us to achieve, I think that's the one for me. That's the litmus test. Is this thing, does it have the potential to change the industry, to change consumers, customers, as much as the waves that have gone before? And quite frankly, until AI came along, I hadn't seen anything. Everything I've seen up until now was a feature or a ripple.
Yeah.
And ripples can be fairly big. I'm not diminishing the fact that new pieces of technology can help us achieve good things, but they're not of the scale of waves.
So, well, because I think that's a really interesting thing to look back at. Leads in nicely to a question I had for you. But I think looking at the history of what we've had before, and looking at that as kind of a guide to what we might be doing in the future that might become a wave. Let's talk about kind of where we are today. Then, so so in the book, the kind of the current situation that most enterprises are in is kind of that third wave. So what is the third wave? What made it a wave, and what does, and then we maybe we talk a little about what that might look like in terms of adopting this kind of fourth wave. So, but yeah, why don't we start there with then? So, kind of where we are today, that third wave. How did we get there, and how did you see that as a wave?
So it's funny. So let me kind of describe the characteristics of a wave first of all, because there are typically 4 steps in a wave. This may change in the future. It may have, before my time, it may have been different. But in the waves that I've lived through in my time in the industry, there are typically 4 steps that we go through. The first one is that kind of that flurry to adopt. People have spotted that there's something new out there, and there's a general consensus that it's going to really define things, really change things. And what typically happens is, regardless of how much structure and rigidity companies put in place, different groups realize the value that this could offer to them, and they all go off and adopt different things in different ways using different implementations of technology. But the business really gets value from it. As these new things come back into the business, whether it's AI or the waves that have gone before, the business gets real value from that. The problem is that what's new today is old tomorrow, and everybody starts to catch up. You're on that leaders laggards curve, right? Yeah. The adoption curve. So then as everyone else starts to catch up and your first mover advantage starts to diminish, usually at that point we sort of move from steps 1, 2 into 3, which is we look across this thing that we've built and think, oh my God, we've built a monster. Which takes us to step 4, which is we try and simplify and optimize and automate to prepare ourselves because we know there's another wave coming. And we do that every single time. And I'm not saying it's wrong, because actually if the value you get from step 1, which is people going out to embrace this technology and bringing it back in, if that outweighs the impact of you having to consolidate and automate and optimize, it was the right thing to do. But it's useful to know that. And that's typically also an indicator of a wave forming. Because if you see step 1 starting to happen, which is a lot of different groups all starting to work out how they could embrace this technology, how they could start to work with this new thing, that's a really good sign that something's happening. Because as I said before, a characteristic of a wave is democratization.
Yeah.
So if lots of people aren't going out and trying to exploit the value of this thing, then it's maybe not democratized. So that kind of intrigues me. But the third wave, which is really what your question was, it is cloud, right? So the first wave was this move from monolithic to more modular mid-range technologies. The second wave was virtualization. The third wave has been cloud. And we are somewhere between steps 1 and 3.
Yeah.
Most organizations, because the adoption curve is, it's not overnight. It takes a fair period of time. So what's kind of interesting when you look at that, the reason I think it fascinates me is because most companies are using the cloud, I think, different levels or different amounts for different companies in different industries. But what we've got ourselves to is we're in a really similar situation today as we were before the second wave. So, and what I mean by that, so for people watching this, and I wish I could see how many hands go up, how many people watching this remember the world before virtualization?
Yeah, it's just me and you, isn't it? Yeah.
It's depressing how fewer hands go up whenever I talk about this kind of story to groups of people.
Nobody watching in the studio we're in now, none of them know what we're talking about.
They don't even know what I'm talking about, which is fine. I feel quite safe here that the hands didn't go up around here, and I don't feel that that's a reflection of my age. But what's really interesting is that there are many of the problems that we're trying to deal with today because of the cloud. So, if you think before VMware, people went out and brought technologies in to support particular applications. And we built this massive silos, and they were underutilized, and they were challenging to back up, and they required huge amounts of skills. They were complex. They were difficult to secure. And VMware kind of solved that for us. So roll forward to today, where you've got lots of different groups of people inside organizations who are going out and using AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. We're building another set of technology silos. They're just not physical technology stacks, they're cloud stacks. And it's interesting that many of those problems that we solved back in 2010, 2012 have come back again. We've got underutilization, we've got complexity, we've got challenges for backup and security and disaster recovery and, all of those things. But the answer isn't necessarily the same. And I know this might be a bit controversial for some people, but the answer, I don't believe, is more virtualization. Yep. I think the freedom that people have got from the clouds is one of the reasons why they use them. And somehow creating some sort of uber wobbly virtualization thing of all these clouds, it's not the way that people will solve the problem this time round. But we have to look at standardization. We have to start to find ways of, are there ways we can standardize services across these silos that we've built that give us the freedom that we want, but take away the underutilization, the complexity, the security, the skills shortages that take away from those things? And I think that's the moment we're in at the moment, is this, people are still benefiting from cloud. Some people are starting to realize that they've had the benefits from cloud. And there's a lot of people are now starting to look at it and going, we've done it again. We've done exactly the same thing this time round as we did the first time and the second time.
Yeah, we've learned, we've forgotten all the good practice we did in the data center.
Most people weren't there. That's the thing is, I asked a room full of people, how many of you remember the world before VMware? And no one's and a few hands go up. So they weren't there to remember that we've done this before.
Yeah. And I think that's what, I think it's always an interesting, one of the things I remember, a piece of advice, might have even been from you, but a piece of advice about, as people moved to the cloud, don't forget all the good practice you learned in the data center in the first place. Take that with you, because, and it was interesting the way he was kind of talking about how rapid adoption, people trying to figure things out, and even almost during kind of the third wave, we've seen that. So, when in 2020, when the world suddenly found itself consumed by COVID, and we suddenly had lots of people needing to work from home, suddenly Microsoft Teams and Zoom, but Microsoft Teams for a lot of organizations was a thing that people thought about and went, oh yeah, that's an interesting thing, but we've got email and we sit in the office, we talk to each other. Why on earth would we bother? Suddenly, you're not sat in the office. Email's not really a real-time communications thing. So suddenly we ended up doing, you guys would have seen it as well, but we ended up doing loads of projects where people were taking a Teams project that either was never going to happen or was going to take 2 years, was suddenly 2 weeks. I want 20,000 people on Teams. And we saw kind of the impact of that on, I was talking to somebody yesterday actually about this, the idea of suddenly we saw the way people allowed access to their systems almost collapse under the weight of this massive change. So that idea of, well, everybody used to VPN in the office, but we only had 50 at a time, and now we've got 5,000 people, and now none of the infrastructure can cope with it. We saw this kind of massive shift all of a sudden. But as you said, that kind of, everybody rushed to deploy, let's say Teams, everybody rushed to deploy Teams. And then we've now spent probably the last 3 years going back and doing that kind of cleaning up process. And this is almost a semi or mini wave within inside that wave that said, well, we did all of this. Now we've got to go and fix all of that, because all the things and sometimes it's born out of necessity. We had to do this thing. Yeah. And in this case, absolutely born out of necessity. But actually we forgot, we couldn't, we weren't almost agile enough to be able to roll anything out that quickly. And I suppose that there was a point to all of that. And my question was going to be, in terms of, because I think it's really interesting that we look at the third wave and the way you've just articulated that around, we had VMware, and I think that virtualization prepared us for moving to the cloud, because we got used to servers not being a physical thing, and servers and applications living in this kind of ephemeral, we can move it, it pops up and we can move it around and then maybe it goes away again. Is there things that you're seeing now that are preparing us for what's kind of coming next? So what are you seeing in terms of this kind of where we sit right now that maybe is preparing us for, or things that we need to prepare a little bit more for kind of that next wave? Big question. There is a question there somewhere.
There is. Let me see if I can. Let me pick that apart a little bit and see if I can give you some thoughts around it. So the one thing that, reflecting on. So I'm a glasses half full person, right? I always have been. I always will be. I will find me any negative situation, and I will find you some little kind of ray of light in that scenario. And if I think about everything you just said about the pandemic and the fact that we went into lockdown, sometimes you have to have an event to trigger a change. Yeah. And I remember pre-lockdown, there were so many companies that would say, oh, we can't do the cloud because of security, and we can't do that because of this, and we can't do this because of that. And then, of course, lockdown happens. And suddenly all those, I'll call them false walls, and maybe a little bit of an unfair term, but suddenly all of those things that we'd sort of put up in front of us as reasons for not doing something, suddenly they came down because we have no choice. So that's my positive from a very, very negative scenario, was it forced a change. It also just forced a social change as well. How many times would you jump in the car to go off for a meeting with somebody for half an hour because you felt it was the right thing to do, or you felt you weren't showing them enough respect? If now it's quite easy for us to say, can we just do this as a Zoom call, or can we do this as Teams? So we needed an event to trigger a change of social behavior in the way that we interact with people. So that was kind of one piece that I took away from that. I think the other thing is that we're also in a world now where competition is at an unprecedented level. And I remember going back maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I remember George Kurian, who's our CEO, he called a group of us together who were looking at AI in different parts of the business. I remember him walking into the room and he opened the meeting. He said, the companies that get this right will be 40% more productive than the companies that don't. And no company can survive that.
Yeah.
That was one of those moments where you suddenly realize, if that's the CEO saying that that's the level of profound impact that AI is going to have, you can suddenly see that this is different. Every company is now starting to truly realize that this isn't about reducing costs. This isn't about making things a little bit more agile. This is fundamental. This is about making your company 20, 30, 40% more productive. And if you don't embrace that, how do you compete? So I've given you a couple of different answers, but I think they sort of fitted with some of the threads. So I think AI this time, it isn't just that the technology's there. I think there is an impetus coming from CEO board level down that he's driving this throughout businesses. And I've not seen that before. Even in the other waves that we've seen before. I think this one is more profound.
I think, what's really interesting about that is that, one of the things reading the book, and I've known you for a long time, me and you've had a similar kind of IT career. I think we started off as techies, we started off with, very technically focused, we've still got a technical focus. But over time, I think that last piece you were just talking about there, I think the longer you're in your career and, as you get into maybe places where you're involved in IT strategy or positions of leadership where you're having to make IT decisions and changes, the importance of understanding the business benefit. You start to realize it more, and I think one of my bugbears with the industry is that actually a lot of us are not very good at understanding that. We're not very good, and I include vendors in that. I think vendors can be really poor at articulating the actual benefit of the thing that they do. How is that going to help me as an organization to do more? So I think it's a really important point. And we've had a couple of guests on the show who've really talked really articulately about actually how they try and build business benefit into everything that they do, so that when they present to a board, that they can do that. So I thought it was a really good point. I don't kind of dig into time because we're kind of running a little short on time. I really wanted to kind of dig into this fourth wave, because I know we've talked about AI a little bit.
Yes.
And obviously you've said, and we've not talked about it a lot, but obviously you work for NetApp. You're at NetApp for 19 years. NetApp are indeed fully branded. Fully branded. But but NetApp are a storage company, and one of the things that made me laugh reading through the book, because I've seen it and heard it myself, was the amount of times in that 19 years you've heard the phrase, "Oh, this will be the end of NetApp," or "This will be the end of storage companies." And we were talking before we were recording today about kind of it's very easy to forget the part that. It's not easy to forget the part that data plays, because I think we talk about data all the time, and data is a huge part of kind of AI. But we forget about the importance of the way that storage plays a part in that. And I don't necessarily mean buying, some great stuff in the book about kind of monolithic storage arrays. And we were talking before about how we ended up in the storage industry almost through the same route, which thanks IBM. But in terms of the fourth wave, so we've talked a little bit about AI, but it's a little bit more than that. So from a NetApp point of view, from a storage industry point of view, what does this fourth wave look like, and what's the importance, and what are the kind of the key factors to consider when it comes to kind of the way you're planning your data and storage strategy? A lot there as well. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So I'll start off. Let me start off with one thread, and we'll see where it goes. So we were both there when the whole sort of DevOps movement started to happen, right? And DevOps started for a bunch of different reasons, okay? And we can analyze this for hours, I'm sure. But one of the reasons it started was that there was not a good enough connection between the application developers that were building, developing, modifying, enhancing applications and the infrastructure that was sat behind them. And therefore, there was this missing link, that there was value that was available inside the infrastructure that was not being connected to the value that it could offer to the people who were building the applications. And hey, voila, DevOps came around. That's a gross simplification, but it's important. I think we're back at the same place, is that a lot of people will look at it and say, well, storage is just storage. But it isn't. And we talk at NetApp about intelligent data infrastructure, because what we're building into storage is so much more than storing data. It is in encryption, it's autonomous ransomware protection, it's compliance, it's all of those things. And I think we're going to be seeing a very similar situation. I think this is kind of the rebirth of DevOps, because I think they will become the people that connect the data scientists to the infrastructure. And I met a data scientist, this goes back a few years ago, and I remember being introduced, and he said, who are you? What do you do? And I said, I'm Matt Watts. I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist for NetApp. And he said, NetApp, what do they do? So that's a really interesting question, because where do you go with that? Yeah. If I'd have said storage company, the blood would have drained from his face, and you'd have thought, oh God, why me? Why this conversation? Why this person? And I said, I'm NetApp. I said, we help companies build intelligent data infrastructures. And he said, what does that mean? Which is fine. That's a conversation. That's great. And I said to him, what if I could build you an intelligent data infrastructure where you could take a point-in-time copy of any amount of data such that you have a revision of every set of data that you use to train a model at any point in time? His eyebrow went up. And I said to him, what if I could also create a replica of that data that consumes no additional storage, that's available instantly, such that you could have multiple scientists training your data in parallel? And his other eyebrow went up. I said, what if I can enable you to do that, whether it was on premises, whether it was in AWS, Google Cloud, or Microsoft Azure? And he said, that would fundamentally change my business. I said, that's what we do. And I think that's the missing link. I don't talk about NetApp as a storage company, because storage, unfortunately, is a dirty word. You immediately pigeonhole yourself. So I love the fact that over the last year or two, we've been building out this whole message around intelligent data infrastructure, because it's that decoder ring. It's the lens that you can talk to somebody through, that means there's no preconception as to who you are and what you do, but your value that you offer comes through. But I think DevOps has one of the most fundamental roles to play in bridging that gap between infrastructure and this new group of data scientists who aren't thinking about it.
Yeah.
And they'll be instrumental to kind of making sure that the wave reaches its full potential.
And I think it's a really interesting example. And one of the things that, if anybody had ever seen Matt present, one of the things he does really well is that kind of story piece. And there's a bit in his book about that. He's written a book. Did we mention it?
It's on Amazon.
Anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And in hardback, as I found out today. But I think that kind of, so there's two things that's really interesting in that. I think one is the importance of understanding the business need. So, what is it that person, as a data scientist, I like the idea that measuring data science enthusiasm is by eyebrows. 2 eyebrows, I mean,
that's
they're cooking.
really something.
But I think that idea of understanding what's the business problem you're trying to solve. That's what we do. Because I think, and again, it might actually be a phrase pinch from you. Storage is boring. Was that you?
Storing is boring. Yeah.
But that kind of, and it is, the idea of, I've got some storage, got some spinning disks in. Well, that's not very exciting. And it doesn't even have spinning disks. It's even less exciting. But it's about what does that enable. So so I think that's a really interesting part of that. But you talked in there as well about this idea of intelligent data infrastructure. And I think that's also a really important point. I was speaking with a vendor not in the storage industry actually yesterday, and they were talking about how they're using the data in their platform to start to develop policies, using AI to actually develop policies in that platform to be able to share with the user and say, hey, look, you're doing this thing, but actually what we're seeing is this thing over here. And because we're seeing this thing, we suggest you might want to try this. A bit like you watch something on Netflix. People who watch this also did this. Well, people who are doing what you're doing are missing this thing here. You might want to do that. And it's that kind of that kind of efficiency that's interesting. But tell me a little bit more about that kind of intelligent data infrastructure idea and what does that include in it? Because I think that's useful maybe for people watching to understand maybe some of the areas they want to be thinking of in their data infrastructures are, can we do that? Is that something we need to be able to do?
So it goes back to something we talked about earlier on, which I said the answer going forward is we start thinking about these kind of cloud silos. The answer to that is not, I don't believe is more virtualization. Yeah. Virtualization will be a part of that. So will enterprise applications, native applications, elastic applications, containerized applications. The world is grown beyond just virtualization. But standardization is really important. So how do you start to look at creating these sort of layers of standardization that enable you to work with any cloud, that enable you to work with any application in any cloud, but give you that sort of consistency across them? And that's what we've been building towards, putting our technology as a first-party service, our storage technology as a first-party service into all 3 of the cloud providers, means that aside from their own native storage services, where I would argue we offer advantages over those, there is not another storage service you can connect to native applications inside the cloud, first-party applications. So we initially built this to say, what if you could have one way to store, manage, protect, encrypt, deduplicate, backup, tier your data for any cloud and for any application across any cloud? Virtual, elastic, containerized, doesn't matter. That, I believe, is the way that we start to solve the complexity problems of running these multi-cloud scenarios, is these kind of layers of standardization. What that's led to, because we did that very much for the cloud era, what it's led to now is that we now have the ability to connect our storage natively into SageMaker, into Vertex AI, so we now have a storage service, consistent storage service that runs across any cloud that can be directly connected into those native AI tools that are running in the cloud. So did we do that? Was that luck, genius, an incredible foresight? I don't know. I'll take a little pinch of all of those things. But what we did in the 3rd wave, which has huge value for everybody, has prepared us and I think has set the groundwork out for what companies are going to need to do as we go into the 4th wave.
And it's interesting that if you think about that kind of, and I'm a big fan of that idea of, what NetApp used to call a data fabric, I guess. But that idea of, and I've talked about this with people for a long time, that idea of a consistent storage layer across all clouds, on-prem, whether you run in a colo facility, whether you run in a virtual appliance, actually the fact that you can take that consistent storage layer is hugely important.
And that it adds value, and that it does more than just store data, right?
Well, you gave that example before, didn't you, about with the data scientist, that what if I could do this, what if I could do that? And the only reason you can do that is because I've got consistency across all of these places.
Yeah.
And then that makes your whole, and the thing that struck me is you were talking before about kind of learning from things we've done in the past, and if we were to go back to that kind of virtualization wave or even probably that second wave where we talked about virtualization, nobody at the time was saying, well, in the data center that I've got here in Liverpool, I'm going to use this set of, I'm going to use VMware with this and over here. Now I've got a data center in Manchester. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to use Hyper-V and I'm going to use something else. And those two things won't be able to talk to each other. Nobody's designing that. Nobody's then building a third data center and let's do something in there that doesn't talk to the other two. Nobody designed that. However, we've moved to the cloud and designed exactly that, where we've gone, these things, they can't run over here. And so we end up with this kind of, you end up almost with this industry that's trying to build a consistency layer over the top of that. But if you can design with consistency in mind, it opens up a lot of potential benefit, I think.
I agree. And, jokingly, I don't call them data centers. I call them a museum of bad IT decisions or even a museum of past IT decisions. As we talked about how these waves form, sometimes we do things with the best of intentions and the value that they give us to begin with outweighs the fact that they may create complexity downstream. But I think having gone through this 3 times in the past, and you think, well, actually, there are some fairly basic things that we could do in step 1 of a wave forming that won't take anything away from us whatsoever. They won't remove any of the freedom, but they will increase the utilization. They will create a standardization. They will create a level of simplicity, of security, and they'll add consistent value. That's the bit that really excites me, is having been here through the first 3 waves. What have I learned from that? There are things I would do as the 4th wave is forming that won't take anything away, but will make steps 3 and 4, as we get to them, which we will very quickly, it'll make those things a damn sight easier for us.
That feels like a great place to kind of wrap up, I think. I think that's a great piece of advice, to look back at, what have we done in the past that's worked? And then think about, as we kind of adopt this brave new world of AI and intelligent data infrastructure, et cetera, as we do that kind of thing, understanding what can we need to do now at this very early stage to make sure that actually we don't find ourselves, not only take the good things, but make sure that we don't find ourselves making all the same mistakes that we made in waves 1, 2, and 3. So I think that's a great place to stop. So I mean, actually, before we wrap up, so for an IT leader or somebody looking in an IT leadership position, is there any tip that you would give them beyond that to say, these are the things you might want to think about? Any tip? Any great piece of advice? Terrible piece of advice. I mean, either way,
it could be either. But I might think it's good advice. People might think it's terrible advice. So I think going back to something I said earlier on in our chat, I think manage ripples and ride waves, and vendors will be very guilty of trying to convince you that whatever it is that they're doing today is the wave of the future, when frequently it is just a ripple.
I mean, not NetApp.
No, not us, of course. But so I think just having that in the back of your mind, be constantly thinking, is this a ripple or a wave? Just allows you to start working out how much attention, how much investment, how much time and effort you put into some of those things. Because when we do spot those waves, they are multi-billion opportunities for organizations. So I think be conscious of ripples and waves. And then I think the other thing that I would give as advice to people is find a way of trying to almost visualize the quantities of data. My team, I have them build what I call magic roundabouts. And effectively, magic roundabouts are advanced visualizations of lots of different things. I look at the total addressable market to work out where are people spending the most money on different solutions and how is that changing over time, because it gives me signposts for things that I should look at in more detail. I do the same for tech trends. We map everything that comes into us from Gartner hype cycles, all of the different datascapes, whatever it might be. And then I model those into a visualization where I can start to work out, are they 12 to 18 months, 18 months beyond? Are they 5 years out? And then we update that every 6 months so I can see how these things are changing. So I think sometimes step back and look for patterns rather than trying to dig into too much detail around any one thing. It's that if you can build these landscapes and then start to see how these landscapes are changing, I think you stand a much better chance of filtering out the stuff that probably vendors are trying to convince you has all the value. And also then it gives you a chance to spot things that could be the fifth wave. And I'll be happy to come back as we release the next version of the book and we can talk about the fifth wave. But which I think, one thing I have learned, and maybe it's my last comment, the waves are coming out as quicker than they ever did. The first wave probably took 10, 15, 20 years to sort of form, and it still carries on today. The second wave was probably about 10 years, maybe 12 years. The third wave, I think, has probably been about 8 years. I think the fourth wave will be less. I think it will probably be 3, 4, maybe 5 years, but it will certainly be less. If we carry on with that trend, suddenly the next wave is 2 to 3 years. The wave after that is 1 to 2 years. So
we might squeeze 2 more waves in yet.
I think I might have 2 more before I retire to a desert island and let somebody else worry about the damn waves.
Well, look, Matt, it's been great. We've run a little bit longer than we normally do on CTO Insights, but this has been such an interesting chat. I thought I might as well keep going, and you could all tune in or split it into 2 or whatever you want to do with it. But just keep listening. So, Matt, if people want to find out a little bit more about the kind of stuff you cover and kind of your latest thoughts on the industry, where's a good place to do that?
Well, I've written a book, which is available on Amazon.
We'll mention that.
But I mean, to be honest, I'm probably most prolific on LinkedIn. That's typically where I kind of post my thoughts, my observations. So, but I'd love to hear from people. If you're watching this and you want to have a chat about something, you've got some thoughts, some disagreements, they're always quite a lot of fun. And yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn or WhatsApp netapp.com. We can go back to the old way of doing things and use email.
That's and the fact you're just what's that? So we did mention Matt has written a book. I highly recommend it. Particularly for somebody who's been, for me, I think for me who's been in the industry for a similar amount of time, it's an interesting look back, and it's an interesting conversation about a whole bunch of technologies that not necessarily forgotten about, but you think, oh, I remember that happening, and actually, but it's interesting to see. So even if you haven't been knocking around the industry as long as I have, it's interesting to see a lot of the things that Matt's just talked about how those waves have impacted things, because it does give you pointers to kind of how that's going to change in the future. So highly recommend it. Available on all good Amazons anywhere in the world, and you can get that in hardback, paperback. I don't know. You're going to do an audio book? Are you going to read it to people?
I've been asked, but I'm not sure people really need to be listening to me for several hours. But if I get enough requests, I'll think about it. I'll even use my original accent, because I'm from the West Country. So my normal accent is I speak like a pirate. Yeah. I hide it very, very well.
I don't want to get Sir Anthony Hopkins to do it. It feels like it'd be a good step in, but maybe West Country Matt would work as well.
Indeed.
So Matt, look, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming up to Liverpool, doing the show with us today, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
It's been a pleasure, Paul. Thanks for the conversation.
And if you've enjoyed the show, and I'm sure you have, don't forget we'll put notes into where you can find Matt's book on Amazon. I'd probably just type the fourth wave in is probably enough. That'd probably find it. But if you enjoyed the show, but if you have got any comments, as Matt said, then please leave them in the comments wherever you can do that, or contact the show through all the normal channels. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next CTO Insights, and do subscribe, can subscribe here on YouTube in the normal way by clicking things. Oh, do click a thumbs up as well. It helps other people to find the show on YouTube. And you can also subscribe in all good homes of podcasts, and as I always say, potentially some bad ones as well. So until next time, thanks for checking out CTO Insights. We'll see you soon.